Howdy folks, welcome back to Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, and we're continuing the story of places that I've been to before and while I was in the Royal Navy. We're still in Africa, although the rolling green fields down below us might be confusing you as to exactly which part of Africa we're in. In 1986 we left South Africa and returned to England. I then spent the best part of 3 years not doing particularly well in school. And then in 1989 I joined the Royal Navy. After 6 weeks of basic training and 6 months of communications training, in 1990 I was posted to join my first ship, HMS Brazen, in the Middle East. HMS Brazen was a Type 22 frigate, and 1990 was not a particularly good year for the Middle East because it was the year of the First Gulf War. I flew out to join HMS Brazen in a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, flying out of Royal Air Force Lynham. It was a 20-hour flight. A C-130 Hercules is not a luxurious private jet like this Cessna Citation Longitude, for example. It's a cargo aircraft. And this Hercules was no exception. It was packed full of cargo, which didn't leave a lot of space for we 3 or 4 passengers. Also, it's not a pressurised cargo aircraft, so while that on the one hand meant that it wasn't flying at a sufficient altitude for the pilot to asphyxiate everybody, it was flying at a sufficient altitude for us all to nearly freeze to death. Luckily, at one point, several hours into the flight, I discovered that if you climbed on top of the cargo pallets, you were close enough to the steam and hydraulic pipes in order to be able to endure the flight without dying of exposure. Also, the toilet facilities on board a Hercules are positively medieval. They basically consist of a hole that you sit on. Although the crew had at least gone to the trouble of erecting a sort of makeshift privacy shield in the form of a shower curtain that was arranged around the hole. But the temperatures that you had to endure while you were sitting on board this, what was basically an open hole in the belly of the aircraft, didn't encourage loitering around enjoying a really good dump. We made precisely 2 stops on this 20-hour flight. The first was at Royal Air Force Akrotiri in the middle of the night, where the crew, because they're Royal Air Force and so they're precious little snowflakes, got taxied off to a hotel for the night. We, of course, weren't allowed to leave the aircraft, and because we were on the ground, that meant we couldn't even use the rudimentary toilet facilities. So instead, we just had to sit in the back of this C-130 Hercules on the taxiway at Royal Air Force Akrotiri for the 8 or 9 hours that it took for the crew to enjoy a good night's sleep in a hotel, polish off a nice hot hotel breakfast, and then casually get back to the aircraft in order to continue the second leg of the journey. As I'm sure you can imagine, even at this early point in my Royal Navy career, where I'd only been in the Navy for a little over 6 months and I hadn't even seen my first ship, I was already learning a deep and healthy contempt for the Royal Air Force. Something that would last, well, forever basically. We were in the air for another few hours and then we stopped in the middle of a desert somewhere. To this day I have no idea precisely where. I don't even know what country we were in. We were allowed out of the aircraft to stretch our legs for the first time in about 16 hours. But given that we'd just descended from the sub-zero temperatures at whatever altitude we were flying at to the middle of the desert, somewhere in the Middle East, in the middle of the day, let's just say that we didn't have time to acclimatise to the oven-like temperatures that we were suddenly confronted with. So nobody really stuck around to have much of a walk. In any case, we were only there for half an hour or so, taking on fuel, and then it was back into the air for another few hours before arriving at Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where nobody was expecting us. And we had to sit around for a few hours before some Royal Air Force officer decided that maybe we should get these sailors to a ship somewhere, arranged some transportation, and drove us to Dubai, where I had to wait a week in a hotel because my ship was out doing boarding operations. Now, this is not normally. They normally do it in their ship, and if they're going to do it in their ship, the way that they usually go is through here. The Suez Canal in Egypt, Port Said, just over there to the left-hand side of the screen, and the Suez Canal, that extremely long and extremely unnaturally straight-looking waterway, that heads south for a couple of 100 miles until it reaches the Bitter Lakes. So I didn't travel down the Suez Canal in 1990, but I did on more than one occasion over the course of the next 22 years. And the Royal Navy has a long association with Alexandria, Cairo and the Suez Canal, not least of which because we tried to steal it in, when was it, 1956? The Suez Crisis. Not long after World War II. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of those traditions involve the Gully Gully Man, who is basically a traditional Egyptian illusionist and magician, and they would come on board the ship while at anchor in Port Said, while you're waiting your turn to go through the Suez Canal, and put on a magic show, which was usually very, very good on the flight deck. You'd also get what we call bum boats coming up alongside the ship, full of people just trying to sell you stuff, and you could often get a lot of bargains, and you could also often get completely ripped off. But once the ship started to proceed south down the canal, a number of the ship's company, the lucky ones, would get to leave the ship, jump into buses, and get taken off to see some of the tourist attractions that Egypt has to offer in the area around Cairo and Alexandria. So what sort of tourist attractions are you talking about here, Jingles? Luxor, the Valley of the Kings? Sadly, no. Luxor and the Valley of the Kings are amazing places to visit, but they're a little bit out of the way for the crew of the ship that's travelling through the Suez Canal, who've been debonked into buses for a few hours, because you have to rejoin the ship further down the canal after you've done your sightseeing. However, there are some fairly famous Egyptian tourist attractions just on the outskirts of the city of Cairo. And I really do mean just on the outskirts of the city of Cairo, because the pyramid complex and the Sphinx, you could quite literally throw a stone from one of those pyramids and hit the Cairo suburbs. I had two opportunities to visit the pyramids, and I only took advantage of that opportunity once, because, how can I put this? I don't want to try to understate the archaeological and cultural significance of the Sphinx and the pyramid complex here in Cairo, because these are amazing World Heritage Sites. Except the problem is they're not amazing World Heritage Sites for a number of reasons. The first is because it's very difficult to actually find a vantage point to view the pyramids and see them as they would have been thousands of years ago, without the suburbs of Cairo and the noise of the suburbs of Cairo getting in the way. Also, they're covered in graffiti. Although some of the graffiti is so old that the graffiti itself has archaeological significance. And also, they're not actually that impressive to look at. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're an amazing feat of ancient engineering, but they're not actually that big. I mean, we build things that are bigger than the pyramids every day. And the final reason is because it's impossible to walk 10 feet at the pyramids or at any tourist attraction in Egypt without somebody trying to sell you some cheap plastic souvenir shit. Which really detracts from the experience. So I visited the pyramids once, and that was more than enough for me. So anyway, back to the Suez Canal itself. Is it sad that I actually found the Suez Canal a more impressive sight than the pyramids? Obviously it doesn't have the same archaeological significance, but it's not historically insignificant, and it's a fairly impressive feat of engineering in its own right. Now, when you're in a warship passing through the Suez Canal, as I was on board HMS Newcastle, a Sheffield-class Type 42 destroyer, it's a, how can we put this, politically and militarily volatile area of the world. So you have to have armed sentries on the upper deck the entire duration of your transit down the canal. And while I was taking a turn as one of these armed sentries, there was a surprising number of things to see along the canal itself, none of which unfortunately you can actually see here in Microsoft Flight Sim. On the left hand side of the screen as we're looking at it, on the eastern side of the canal, that is actually a massive raised anti-tank berm that runs pretty much the entire length of the canal, almost all the way down to the Bitter Lake. Also, scattered at irregular intervals along the length of the anti-tank berm, in fact along both sides of the canal, Lots and lots of burnt out, knocked out tanks, mostly, from what I can tell, T-55s. No idea how long they've all been there. No idea if they were even all shot up in the same conflict because, well, it's the Middle East. Pick any year out of the last, 60 or 70 since the T-55 was built, and people would have a really hard time proving categorically that the year you chose couldn't possibly have been the year in which that particular tank was knocked out along the Suez Canal. Well, anyway, after doing the Suez Canal transit, you head south through the Red Sea, then you take a quick left turn, hope that the Iranians don't have itchy trigger fingers as you transit the Straits of Hormuz, and after a couple of days, you're about to make your first stop at what many, for very good reason, consider to be the single best run ashore in the whole of the Persian Gulf, and that, of course, is Dubai. After landing in the desert in Riyadh, or just outside Riyadh, and being shuttled to Dubai to await my ship, actually that was quite an experience in and of itself. I mean, don't forget, I was still pretty young. I was only 20 years old at the time, and I'd just been flown halfway across the world to a completely different country and a radically different culture, put up in a 4-star hotel at the Navy's expense to wait for my first ship because it had been delayed due to an unexpected boarding operation that it had to conduct. This was all in the run-up to the First Gulf War, so there were a lot of boardings and searches and seizures taking place. So that was a hell of an experience for a young 20-year-old. And Dubai 30 years ago was one hell of an experience. I mean, it's more of an experience now, but it was still a pretty impressive experience back then. Dubai is obviously, or the United Arab Emirates, of which Dubai is the capital, is obviously an Islamic country, but it's a fairly progressive, relaxed and cosmopolitan Islamic country, even back then. For example, you weren't supposed to be able to buy or consume alcohol because of Muslim law, but exceptions were made for the hotels because of the number of foreign guests. And, conveniently enough, I was staying in a hotel, which had an extremely popular bar and nightclub. Now, when you visit Dubai in a ship, you don't actually go to Dubai, you go to the port of Jebel Ali, which is what we're passing over now. And it's here where I first realised the extent of the changes that have happened in and around Dubai over the course of the last 30 years. I mean, I was aware that an obscene amount of money has been pumped into this region over the course of the last 30 years, but I didn't realise it had extended as far as Jebel Ali. I mean, I've seen the Mission Impossible movies. I know what Dubai looks like. But 30 years ago, this place, Jebel Ali, was basically just a massive commercial, oil and industrial shipping port. There was nothing here that wasn't dedicated to industry. And now they've built that. You've probably seen the one in Dubai, or at least seen pictures of it. It's a series of artificial islands made into the shape of a big old palm tree. And there's nothing industrial about that. That is, or is going to be, an extremely rich tourist's playground, and it's the last thing I expected to see here in Jebel Ali. Because 30 years ago, aside from all the industrial and commercial buildings and warehouses, there was absolutely nothing in Jebel Ali for visiting sailors to enjoy, other than a tiny seaman's mission, which admittedly did serve beer and also cooked an amazingly good chicken curry. In fact, it's the first time I had ever tried a curry, and it nearly killed me because it was incredibly hot, but it was so tasty. And I think the Seamen's Mission building was just there on the left. This is where HMS Brazen was docked. It's where I joined the ship back in 1990. And that is pretty much all that was here for visiting sailors to take advantage of. Most of the time, if leave had been granted, you would leave the ship. You might stop at the Seamen's Mission if you weren't feeling particularly ambitious, or if money was tight. Or if there weren't any taxis waiting and you just stopped for a quick beer while you waited for a taxi to turn up. But most people would basically jump into a taxi, or a bus if the ship had had one laid on, and go into Dubai, which was up the road here. Because Dubai was amazing. Even back then, 30 years ago, there were lots and lots of shops where you could buy fake designer goods, which is true of just about any city in the Middle East. But even 30 years ago, Dubai was on the up and up. And as well as the shops where you could buy fake designer goods, there were also plenty of shops where you could buy the real thing. I remember in particular, I was looking to buy a new watch and expecting to be buying a fake designer watch. And I found one shop in Dubai that was selling tag watches, and they weren't the fakes. You could tell by the price tags. $5,000 for a watch. Yeah. Also, there was a booming industry at the time, because don't forget this was before Blu-rays, it was before DVDs, hell, it was even before CD-ROMs. And there was a booming industry in bootleg VHS tapes. And every mess deck on board a ship had a VHS player and a TV. So we bought a lot of pirated movies. They were usually of pretty good quality, and in many cases we were able to get the movies pirated in Dubai before they'd even been released in the cinema back in the UK. In fact, people were buying so much stuff in Dubai because it was all so incredibly cheap that we were running out of places on board the ship to put it all. The ratings baggage store was full, nobody had any space left in their lockers, so stuff was starting to spill out into other places that weren't really supposed to be used for storage, especially on a ship that was expecting to go to war in the next couple of months. In fact, the situation got so bad that at one point I can remember the executive officer made an announcement. I can't remember his name, but I can remember him making the announcement, I was on duty at the time, that people were to immediately stop buying big and bulky items when they were ashore in Dubai because we were running out of places to store them on board the ship. Which was particularly amusing, because a couple of hours later, and I remember clearly because I was on duty at the time, the executive officer came back from Dubai and he bought a fucking laser dinghy. A boat. Complete with a mast and a sail. And mustered the duty watch, which is why I remember, because I was on duty at the time, to manhandle this boat over the gangway and store it inside the funnel, just hours after he'd made the announcement that we were to stop doing things like this. The reason I mention all this isn't just to point out what a massive hypocrite the executive officer was, but, well, a couple of months later, after the Gulf War, on our return to the UK, the night before we got back into Plymouth, a couple of members of the ship's company decided that they were going to get their revenge on the executive officer, went into the funnel, untied his boat, and ditched it over the side of the ship, where it washed up on the southern coast of England in bits a couple of days later. Nobody ever found out who did it, certainly the executive officer didn't, and I wish I'd known who'd done it because I'd like to buy them a beer. I initially thought I was going to be flashing up Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 and going for a flight over Dubai and trying to spot things that I could remember from 30 years ago, and then I saw the actual extent of the changes that have been made here, and I realised that there was no way I was going to recognise anything. It's almost certainly all been demolished and built over with, well, things like, just look at this. I mean, it's not so much that Dubai has been rebuilt, it's more that it's been terraformed. Take a look at this residential complex, for example. This was not here 30 years ago. This was desert 30 years ago, as you can tell by the surrounding area. I mean, look at that. It's kind of like the Palm, a series of artificial islands just on a smaller scale. Can you imagine what the real estate values are of these houses? Look at this. This will be where the millionaires live. There's a whole bunch of things in Dubai that I don't recognise because they just weren't here 30 years ago, but then you've got things like this massive black skyscraper that I don't recognise, not just because it wasn't here 30 years ago, but because it's also not on Google Maps, which is, I mean, I don't know if that just means that it's too new to appear on Google Maps, or whether that's because Microsoft Flight Sim are just making stuff up and putting in Arthur C. Clarke 2001 A Space Odyssey jokes. If you live in Dubai, or if you've been to Dubai recently, like in the last year or so, is that thing actually there? Because it's not there on Google Maps. There are a couple of buildings under construction in that rough area on Google Maps that might now be that building, but your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea what it is. This, of course, everybody's seen. This is the Palm. Actually, it has a specific name. There are two of them now. There's one in Jebel Ali and there's one here in Dubai itself. And you can't get a street view of this place in Google Maps, which is interesting, because you can get a street view of just about everywhere that isn't a military facility on Google Maps, and this is definitely not a military facility, although the people that live and play in this place probably have more money to throw around than most militaries, so they can probably afford to pay Google off for the privacy of not being able to get down and have a street view on Google Maps. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The palms aren't the only artificial, natural, if that makes sense, wonder on display in Dubai, of course. There's also the World Islands. They're named that because they're a bunch of islands, and there they are up ahead, which have basically been laid out to compose a map of the world, which will become apparent as we get closer. Each one of these islands is an obscenely expensive and elite residential area for the kind of people who can also afford to pay Google enough to not have their grubby little cameras down at street level, so commoners like us can't see what this actually looks like on Google Maps, not from street level anyway. There's a sort of artificial reef being constructed around it, which serves two purposes. First, it prevents the common mob, the tourists, from getting closer than absolutely necessary, so as not to interfere with the lifestyles of the rich and famous. And also, it functions as a seawall against anything as inconvenient and common as the weather, which seems like a bit of an extravagance because the weather in the Gulf is pretty good. I mean, the Gulf itself, more so than even the Mediterranean, which can have some pretty nasty storms, the Gulf it's like sailing on a mill pond. It's the flattest and calmest stretch of open water I have ever known, with practically zero swell and very little in the way of inclement weather. I mean, there's a reason this whole place is desert. It just doesn't rain here. Not all of these islands have been developed. I mean, there are only so many billionaires in the world after all. But there's still plenty of real estate here for the likes of Bono and Sting to snap up. Just probably not us. And of course, we couldn't do a virtual tour of Dubai without seeing the Burj Khalifa. And there it is. 830 meters tall, 160 floors, as well as hotels, restaurants, and offices. Inside that thing there is also an 11-hectare park. No sign of Tom Cruise, though. What are you talking about, Jingles? Come on, Mission Impossible. But anyway, that's Dubai. Looks nothing like the Dubai I remember from 30 years ago. Well, except for the weather. The weather hasn't changed. And I don't want to go so far as to say I probably wouldn't enjoy revisiting Dubai. I probably would. I probably just couldn't afford it. Not to the extent I could 30 years ago, when it was on the up and up, but still very much an affordable tourist destination, rather than being a tourist destination for the top 0.1%. But then again, they do have a Burger King and a KFC here, so how bad could it be? I mean, as long as they don't serve burgers and fried chicken sandwiches with gold foil on them, I'm sure I could probably afford it. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I hope you've enjoyed this 30-year-old ramble down memory lane and the sights, if not the sounds, of modern-day Dubai, which is pretty much completely with odds at the Dubai that I remember. Nevertheless, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'm looking forward to the next one, because that is it. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.